Hello everyone and welcome to the third of our webinars at the Centre for the Social History of Health and Healthcare at the University of Strathclyde. This webinar is a discussion around the themes of drugs, intoxicants and subcultures, and we're very fortunate to have with us Professor Dan Malik and Dr. Peter Clark. They're going to introduce their research to us. But before I introduce them, this seminar is part of the Centre for the Social History of Health and Healthcare Summer School. And you're very welcome to join us for our next session as well, which is on the histories of birth control. And this is on the 13th of August, and it's with Dr. Laura Kelly and with two of our postgrads, Georgia Granger and Kristen Hay, and it will be chaired by Professor Una Walsh. So I really can't recommend enough how groundbreaking some of this research is and how interesting this seminar will be too. Also, as you're all joining, there was also a summer school for the postgrads last week, and they held an online Twitter conference last Thursday where a number of the postgrad participants shared their research in a series of 10 tweets. And again, if you're a Twitter user, I really encourage you to go back and to look at that research and to contact the participants and really share in their research from that as well. In terms of the logistics of today, we have an hour. Dan and Peter will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have the opportunity to ask questions. So at the bottom of your screens, there's a Q&A button and a chat button. If you could submit your questions on that, that would be great. And I will try and read out as many as possible. You can do this during the talks or after the talks as the ideas come to you. And we'll aim to finish at 2 o'clock. So if I can introduce our first speaker, Professor Dan Malik is an internationally recognised expert in drug and alcohol regulation and prohibition who's based at Brock University, Ontario. He has published widely on the challenges of regulating substances that are considered socially problematic, so alcohol, cannabis, opiates, cocaine. His latest books are When Good Drugs Go Bad, Opium Medicine and the Origins of Canada's Drug Laws, 2015, and a new edited 4-volume collection which came out this year called Drugs, Alcohol and Addiction in the Long 19th Century. I'm sure we'll hear a lot about both of these soon. Dan, we do appreciate this is very early for you. We really appreciate you joining us, and we're looking forward to hearing your research.
All right, well, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, that's just a wave of show of hands. No, okay. Thanks a lot for that, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I'm just going to do the share screen thing right now. Which screen do I want to share? Oh, you get to see this one. All right. Okay. And when Jim invited me to sub in for him today, I was wary because the panel was about subcultures, and I'm not sure if I know what that means when I'm talking about earlier drug history, but I will talk about opium and cultures, and I guess you can't really have subculture without culture. And I want to look at how drug use is problematized within cultures. So let's begin with high culture. You might recognize some of these faces. Opium in the West for much of the first part of the 19th century was equated with Thomas de Quincey, whose Confessions of an English Opium Eater remains in print and is kind of the dazed and confused of Victorian university students. I have my copy right here. I'm not a Victorian University student. His opium use, which he began using as medical treatment and continued to use for the enjoyment of it, and then it became a habit. And those of some of his romantic contemporaries pictured here had numerous effects. It inspired many knockoff drug confessionals, such as the numerous titles I put up there. And it also created the foundation for medical knowledge, since many medical textbooks, when it got to the issue of drug use, simply invited the readers to refer to Misters de Quincey and Coleridge. And I pulled up a few of those there. Well, the top one from Pereira is most notable. Now, medical use of opium was, of course, not unproblematic, but it was generally seen to be a personal choice up to, say, the last quarter of the 19th century. It was the poisonous use of opium that caused more concern. So by the 1860s, pharmacists were pointing at poisonings by opium and other toxic medicines like arsenic and strychnine as reasons that governments should allow them the pharmacist the exclusive right to handle these products along with physicians. And they gradually succeeded in many jurisdictions. Most pharmacy laws required a customer either to have a prescription for specifically controlled drugs listed in drug schedules like these, or at least allowed the pharmacist to distribute drug or to sell drugs to people they were familiar with, and it was sort of a character reference sort of idea. These laws, beginning in the UK in '68, mirrored in places like my province of Ontario in Canada in 1871 and elsewhere, provided a justification for upending laissez-faire ideals of free market with restrictions on certain products that were deemed dangerous, which seemed to many to be a reasonable government intervention. But once these prescription walls were erected, the poison schedules could be expanded based upon an expanded definition of dangerous. And that was actually embedded in the schedule in the British law of 1868. And as people began to consider drug and alcohol habits as behaviors that needed to be dealt with by some kind of professional authoritative intervention, usually medical, sometimes carceral, it was easy to add such items to the pharmacy laws. Most notably was cocaine, which gained rapid medical and social attention in the 1880s, first as a miracle drug for many ailments, including addiction, and quickly transmogrifying into something that could destroy fine young men, including doctors, druggists, and dentists. I intentionally gender it there, all of whom had easy access to it. So we've got, I'm just showing you some classic images. Cocaine was a major target of opprobrium that I would argue eclipsed opiates as a product of concern. Let's just see if I can pull up. So here's sort of the articles, a few articles from ones that are actually extolling its virtues down to some that show how terrible it was. In Canada, for example, nearly all pharmacy acts were modified in the early 1900s to prohibit cocaine from sales except on prescription. And when we had patent medicine laws, they completely prohibited cocaine from being part of patent medicines. It was also linked to African-American use often because landowners in the US South were encouraging their African-American workers to use cocaine to maintain stamina, which created a vicious feedback of racial stereotyping of African-Americans who were, as this article at the bottom notes, these fiends, wild from cocaine, and then created this cyclical argument about the dangers of cocaine. Now this leads us to the other narrative of drugs, the drug use of the racial other, and most notably here, most people will probably be familiar with Chinese opium smoking, and the focus on Chinese people in and outside of their country was really important as well. Many Chinese people traveled to other countries, for example, Australia, Canada, the United States, and South Africa to work in heavy industries such as mining, railway building, as well as market gardening. Of course, they were also in many port towns in a global economy. In each country, they faced resistance and xenophobia, to say the least. So opium smoking was one of the activities pointed to as problematic by host country people. For each host country, there is a slightly different narrative, but normally it involves Chinese people smoking opium and introducing it to white people, often the young, impressionable men and women whose corruption by opium represented the debasement of the nation, right? So we see pictures like this. The other story from those reformers who found the British government's support of the opium trade in China, forcing opium on an unwilling country, and the two wars that characterize this activity, to be a national sin. These are items I found in the British Library a couple of years ago. Their organization, the Society for the Suppression of the Opium Traffic or the Opium Trade, was an active and well-organized reform organization. And one of my favorite documents was this Poppy's Talk with English Boys and Girls About Opium, which starts off, "Are you fond of poppies? I am too." And then goes on to about how terrible opium is. So here we're seeing two impressions of Chinese opium use, but both debilitating and both associated with negative outside influence. The Chinese user is either a degraded and weakened person who needs help in the missionary view, or a devious, corrupt influence on the health of especially young people of the West. Now, this sense of corruption may be best illustrated in this image from the Australian journal, The Bulletin, which was a horribly xenophobic journal. And I apologize for this picture. I'm not going to keep it up long because I really don't like the image. But what it does show is the connection, right? So Asian people were associated with cheap labor, which of course drove down the wages of good white Australians. Pakapu, which is, I think, a lottery game, immorality, smallpox and typhoid, opium smoking, this guy's not doing it right, bribery, although it was an Australian cop who was taking the bribe, fantan, which is a gambling thing, and customs robbery. So I'm going to move on, get out of that, and have a nice picture of my favorite flower. I want to emphasize here a key word, which is perception, because these were impressions and perceptions of Chinese people filtered through a biased media in the eyes of Westerners. Inside the home country, people feared corruption of outsiders. Missionaries in China, looking for funding for their evangelical work or missionary work, presented the recipients of their enlightening activities as degraded by their heathen ways, such as characterized by opium smoking and those other things that the octopus was grasping. And as an aside, when I was researching a chapter on Chinese opium use for When Good Drugs Go Bad, I came across an early missionary account of an old Chinese lady who was vehemently rejecting Jesus because Jesus brought opium to her country. And the account was written to build support for missionary work because, of course, no evangelical would accept the idea that Jesus was the cause of the misery of opium. That was the job of his followers. So recent work has reminded us that we should be careful with our sources lest their skewed perceptions infiltrate our own. The work of scholars such as Richard Newman, Yang Wen-zheng, Frank Decoder, Lars Lahmann, and Zhou Zun began to urge historians to consider how easily we were accepting these narratives of opium's horrible effects. So Newman argued that opium rarely undermined health, and the myths about its use were perpetrated by temperance-minded Westerners. For example, the degraded, sallow, weakened body characterized the opium user was considered an effective opium use, but often people who were suffering from a range of conditions that might make their bodies sallow, degraded, and weakened sought opium for treatment. In other words, Chinese people smoked opium therapeutically just as Westerners ate it or usually drank it. They also show that opium was far less problematic than these foreign observers thought, and that addiction was rare, not unlike the way some people think about alcohol. You know, most people are fine with it, some people have a problem with it. Their work should encourage us to be more mindful of the biases in Western sources, and also that there's often a logic in drug use, even if it's not always clear to the observers. Now, the importance of paying attention to perceptions can sometimes complicate our work as historians. In his celebrated book, Dark Paradise, historian David Courtwright used some clever stats to investigate the demographics of opium addiction in America. I can't describe them because I don't quite understand the complexity, but I'll take his word for it. He concludes that there were far fewer addicts in the country in the early part of the 1900s than claimed by reformers who were pushing for restrictions on opium importations. He also argues that the main users of opium had shifted from middle-class iatrogenic addicts to the subclass, or maybe even the subculture here, of people who were known as pleasure users. This may have been due to the introduction of non-opiate painkillers like phenacetin and aspirin, as well as to the uptake of drugs like heroin as a party drug. But whatever the reason, these demographic shifts are striking. And I say the evidence complicates our work for a few reasons. First, we have to ask ourselves what's more important, the demographics revealed by complex and clever statistics or the juiciness of the story they're contradicting. Now, cultural historians like to look at the stories and the language, and social historians like the data. People like me, trained as a social historian and relatively comfortable with stats, but lured by the appeal of narratives in my work in cultural history, we get a little worried, paranoid, maybe even a little schizophrenic about this. Now, I contemplated this at the end of When Good Drugs Go Bad by saying, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. And I wasn't meaning my writing of the history, but our understanding of it, because it was the story, the impressions of who were the users and the idea that drug use was out of control that drove policy. Those impressions were grounded, of course, in cultural values and cultural fears. The fear of Chinese opium use and the effect of opium, and by this time cocaine, on good, respectable middle-class people, pushed policy in a specific direction without much attention to useful data. It did this because these narratives played onto and upon, or played into and upon, existing moral frameworks and capitalist liberal idealism. The idea of seeking pleasure for pleasure's sake was anathema simply because to many middle-class, liberal-minded reformers, it was dangerous. Carnal pleasure was not considered to be productive of anything except reproduction, and I'm not even sure if that was supposed to be pleasurable to Victorians. Activities that channeled energy from self-improvement to simple enjoyment were destructive because they were not constructive. And just as an epilogue, I should note that this logic persists. Arguments against drug controls today, and we can talk about this at length, manifest a similar cultural logic, but words like morality and self-improvement can be replaced by health and risk factors for disease. The drug use remains problematized according to the values of a culture, but laws can change if the situation they create contradict those same values. And that's all I have for you, so thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was super interesting, and I'm sure everyone's got lots of questions for you. But first, move on to our second speaker, and then we'll take the questions together. So our second paper is given by Dr. Peter Clark. He's a research associate in medical humanities in China and the UK project at the University of Strathclyde. His research interests encompass health, citizenship, everyday life, visual cultures, and most recently, drugs and subcultures. And his recent publication was an article, Problems of Today and Tomorrow, Prevention and the National Health Service in the 1970s in the Social History of Medicine. But today he's talking about a different and a more recent project. And we're looking forward to hearing that, Peter.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction. I'll just share my screen and hope that this works. Right, hopefully that's all okay. So in 1990, this poster appeared on a billboard on Claremont Road in Moss Side, an economically deprived and notoriously violent area of South Manchester, depicting a ghostly pale young man laid prostrate on a hospital bed with all manner of drips coming out of his body. It had a stark warning about drugs to deliver. Sometimes the after effects never wear off. While its message and appearance were very much of a piece with the scaremongering approach employed by mid-1980s health campaigns such as heroin screws you up, the drug that this poster was primarily concerned with was relatively new. 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, MDMA, or ecstasy. First patented by Merck in the early 20th century and reinvented by the Californian chemist Alexander Shulgin in the 1960s and 70s, MDMA had, from the summer of 1988 onwards, become inextricably linked with the nascent rave scene. As author Sarah Champion has suggested, quote, Chicago's house music and the drug ecstasy became a double act like fish and chips. The psychoactive properties of the substance, including euphoria, hallucinogenic effects, and increased energy, were an ideal foil for the new house and techno music sweeping through British nightlife. Capitalizing on this preference for North American dance music, a traveling New York DJ, Lenny D, was struck by the lurid imagery of the poster. Quote, I was in a very strange place experiencing ecstasy for the first time. This poster and billboard was all over the United Kingdom. Needless to say, I thought it was fucking great as I was totally into X. So D was in fact so taken by the poster that he decided to appropriate it wholesale for the label art of his next 12-inch under the moniker Major Problems. With track titles such as Flashback and Overdose, The Final Trip, the record gleefully parodied the shroud-waving tendencies of the Effects Can Last Forever campaign in pursuit of hedonistic abandon. The poster then, and its transatlantic response, are illustrative of the tension at the heart of many cultures of intoxication in the modern era. The possible cost to one's health balanced with the escape from the mundane. At one extremity, the puritanical tendencies of the medical establishment, warning ecstasy users that they were engaging in a, quote, dance of death. At the other, the user whose lifetime consumption reportedly exceeded 40,000 pills. In broader cultural representations of ecstasy and rave, these poles have been represented by widely circulated tabloid headlines and cartoons in the Sun newspaper. and works such as Fiorucci Made Me Hardcore by artist Mark Leckey, that in his own words, wallows in the mire of nostalgia. So this paper briefly suggests one approach of how historians can look beyond these binaries and explore the spaces in between, Stanley Cohen's moral panic, and as Sarah Thornton has described it, subcultural capital. I'll do so by looking at an organization that attempted to mediate between the two at the time, and I'll return to the site where the photo I first showed was taken. Manchester. There are several reasons for using this city as my case study. Firstly, that aside from London, Manchester became the epicenter of rave and acid house, quickly gaining the sobriquet Madchester in tribute to its bacchanalian reputation. Its clubs, in particular the Hacienda, have become valorized in British popular culture, for example, in the actually pretty dreadful 2002 film 24-Hour Party People. Secondly, one of the first widely reported deaths attributed to ecstasy use in July 1989, 16-year-old Claire Layton was in the aforementioned club. And finally, Greater Manchester was the locale served by the drugs harm reduction charity Lifeline. Formed in 1971 and active until its eventual winding up in 2017, Lifeline was significant during the era under consideration for both the ways that they embedded themselves in the lived experience of ravers and clubbers and the success with which they managed to persuade Manchester City Council to adopt their safer dancing guidelines when licensing nightclubs. So in short, this paper attempts to reimagine the responses of ravers in Moss Side, seeing those billboards and how their ways of knowing about ecstasy, raving and health were shaped by Lifeline and interacted with the material conditions in which they lived. And in doing so, I also want to offer an intervention on academic discourses that echo the rhetoric of house music and popular histories, such as Simon Reynolds' Energy Flash or Matthew Collins' Altered State, in highlighting the universalizing affect of ecstasy and club drugs more generally. For example, in their article in the Past and Present special issue on cultures of intoxication, Karen Jo Laidler and colleagues compare the experiences of users of MDMA and ketamine in disparate global cities in the early 2000s. They argue that the pleasure derived from intoxication involves not only a physiological reaction, but also an opportunity to transcend normal everyday routines. In the process of stepping outside of oneself, one may develop a spiritual awareness, a heightened sense of self, of others, and of oneness with the collective. This spirituality lies at the core of the experience of young people in both San Francisco and Hong Kong. So Jo Laidler et al. Therefore make the case for a sort of chemically assisted glocalization in which cultural specificities are acknowledged, but ultimately downplayed in order to highlight their interviewees' transcendent and semi-mystical experiences of MDMA. And clearly these processes were to a certain extent evident in the early years of rave, with American DJ Lenny D's delighted reaction to British anti-drugs billboards. But while rave as pleasure should be taken seriously, and they rightly assert that this pleasure imperative has received relatively little attention from academics, I want to instead follow musician and queer theorist Terry Taimlitz's lead, and in her words, quote, keep sight of the things that we are trying to escape from. As Taimlitz argues in his consideration of New York deep house and drag ball culture in the early 1990s, quote, the house nation likes to pretend clubs are an oasis from suffering, but suffering is in here with us. House is not universal, house is hyper-specific. So for Taimlitz then, quote, house isn't so much a sound as a situation. So what was this situation in Manchester? The Lifeline employee Ian Wardell, speaking to a BBC documentary in 1992, this was, quote, a situation where we have a highly illegal controlled substance being used in an entirely indiscriminate way, extraordinarily dangerous, a massive experiment in the unknown. This world unknown was playing out in the specific context of a northern city in Thatcher's Britain and all its attendant issues of deindustrialization, football hooliganism, conservative gender norms, and organized criminal violence, as Steve Redhurst has discussed in some detail. Ecstasy and house music offered an escape for many young people. But these material conditions also impacted on and intermingled with their lived experiences and the clubs in which they partied. Indeed, gang culture was a crucial aspect of the nighttime economy, for example, with the Cheetham Hill gang effectively running the Thunderdome Club, or the gang-related violence that eventually closed the Hacienda. Alongside the powerful combination of the drugs and the raw, rapturous, repetitive music, it is therefore unsurprising that young people were oblivious to the supposed health risks and any pleas to resist temptation. As Wardell noted, quote, "If you ask a young person why they take ecstasy, they'll be a little bit perplexed. For them, quite obviously and quite clearly, they take it for the pleasure it gives them. Physical pleasure, mental pleasure, the emotional pleasure." So given this rush of excitement, Lifeline took the view that it was pointless to continue making the argument that young people should simply abstain from drugs. As Wardell explained, Lifeline starts from the position of what do you say after you've said just say no? What do you say to those thousands of youngsters who've just said yes? Are you simply to dismiss them, or are you going to listen to them, to listen to what they say, to see whether there is any value in their experience? So Lifeline therefore intended to engage with ravers on their own terms. To do so, they drew on their experiences with users of heroin earlier in the 1980s. Lifeline had pioneered the use of comics as a visually attractive vernacular method of providing harm reduction advice, hiring Michael Linnell to produce a comic in the vein of Vids, a popular satirical and bawdy British magazine. Featuring characters such as Tough Shit Thomas, Locker Room Lenny, or Grandpa Smackhead Jones, the resulting comic, Smack in the Eye, received opprobrium and praise in equal measure from everyone from the Director of Public Prosecutions to the World Health Organization. But Lifeline also made sure to evaluate the comic's effectiveness, and buoyed by its apparent success, began to look into how they might communicate with this new breed of drug users. As Lifeline addressed, quote, "the real problems in working out how to respond to drug use that is an adjunct to fun and pleasure, rather than the organizing force of a lifestyle," Linnell developed a character called Peanut Pete, based on a real-life raver who had engaged with Lifeline services. Like the character he inspired, this young man had a big nose, a head shaped vaguely like a peanut, and his baseball cap on the wrong way around. Sorry, I should make it clear that was a quote rather than my judgment on his appearance. Peanut Pete comics were distributed to record shops and hairdressers, while volunteers handed them out at clubs and raves. They were an instant hit with ravers, with Lifeline producing their own Pete t-shirts after discovering clubbers were making their own bootleg versions. Pete chimed perfectly with the tone and aesthetics of fanzines produced by the scene, such as the comic strips and the unofficial zine of the Hacienda, Freaky Dancing. Indeed, one comic, E by Gum, was published in a special edition with the Hacienda. So these comics were also embedded in the world in which its putative audience moved, referencing Manchester's landmarks, both real and fictional, with Pete at one point confusedly stumbling into the Rover's Return, the pub of TV soap Coronation Street. In another, Pete, seeking respite from his low-paid job, wishes to go to a rave. A fairy godfather appears to both grant his wishes for a mountain of ease, but also warn him of the dangers of possession and taking too many at once, known as stacking. Again, the tone was flippant, but its narrative was grounded in the issues facing young people. Poor employment prospects, low wages, the desire for consumer goods, and the generational divide, illustrated by the brusque exchange between Pete and his father. So Lifeline understood then that raving was not just a hedonistic, bacchanalian impulse, entirely disconnected from everyday life in Manchester, but also that such escapism was a temporary respite. Another Lifeline employee, Mark Gilman, discussed this incursion of harsh socio-economic realities by subverting the Central Office of Information's slogan. Drugs, the effects can last forever, if only. They'd be a damn sight cheaper. You know what I'd like to see? I'd like to see really big posters showing dead, frozen pensioners lying underneath blankets in squalid bedsits, and underneath the posters would read, "Poverty, unemployment, the effects can last forever." But while Lifeline attempted to embed itself in the city's rave culture and speak to the wider issues affecting young people in the Manchester area, its engagement could only ever be partial. Wardell, echoing the preventative consensus of the 1970s I've discussed elsewhere, and espousing a neoliberal rhetoric of individualism and self-reliance, argued that, quote, "One of the things that young people have to realize is that responsibility for using drugs, which might have inbuilt dangers, which might cause imbalances in their brain chemistry, which might lead to overheating, they have to take the responsibility for finding out themselves. And agencies like ours have a clear responsibility to provide as widely as possible and as accessibly as possible the kinds of information which young people can take and read if and when they're going to experiment with these drugs." So what I've attempted to think through in this paper is a method by which historians can investigate ecstasy and rave beyond the broad narratives presented by 90s throwback TV programs or popular histories, by arguing that house is hyper-specific and by using the material produced by a harm reduction charity for and in a particular place. I've started to explore how the consumption of ecstasy cannot be divorced from its social context, despite its apparently universalizing affect. In doing so, I've aimed to recover something of what ecstasy and rave meant to those seeing the billboards on Claremont Road, a temporary escape from Thatcherite Britain, but ultimately one for which the effects could never last forever. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Pedro, again, for a really rich and wonderful paper. We now go to the audience. Does anyone have questions? Maybe I'll start with one for each of the panelists, but if you could put them in the Q&A box or the chat, that would be really helpful. I guess my first question is for Dan, and you talked, and you work on Canada, but you gave a much more global picture. And yes. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit to what is specific to the Canadian context and who is influencing this. So you're talking about America and the black cocaine issues, and you're talking about UK legislation. Who is Canadian legislation influenced by? What's the history there in the 19th century, given that they're not dominions? They don't get dominion status till the
1867. Yeah. Well, the influence, Canadian historians often talk about us sort of somewhere being balanced somewhere between America and Britain as far as the cultural influences. My reading, there's a lot more of a British influence. In fact, it's like the bulwark against Americanism sometimes in Victorian discourse. But when it gets into, so a lot of our medical literature was drawn from, medical, for example, literature was drawn from UK and US sources. We had a few experts, drug experts who got published elsewhere as well. But when it came to the laws, we had our own moral entrepreneur named William Lyon Mackenzie King, who became a prime minister eventually, but he was the deputy minister of labor, and he's one of the people I was thinking of when I said that Confessions of an English Opium Eater was like the dazed and confused of Victorian college students, because he admitted reading it in college and finding it he was looking for something exciting and found it kind of a dull life, right? So, which I thought was interesting, because this guy is presented as this moral entrepreneur. So the narrative in Canada, our pharmacists very much were trying to mirror the British Pharmaceutical Association's strategy, and noted the first, not our first pharmacy law, but the Ontario Provincial Pharmacy Law that had the poison schedule in it was based on the British law, and a lot of the other pharmacy laws were. But then when it came to the legislation, we followed a lot of British legislation, at least looked to Britain to see examples. So we had adulteration acts long before the US and things like that. And then when it came to international, Canada often was part of a British delegation, but in the 1909 Shanghai conference on opium, King showed up late, so he got to do his own presentation. So Canada kind of had a standalone status. The other subsequent conferences that we were part of the British. So there was this balance, but there were some cultural influences from the US, but more, and certainly knowledge influences from both, like in medical and pharmaceutical ideas, but more more of the sense of Britishness as a bulwark. When it comes to racial stuff, I'll just really quickly, because I know there's time. We had a Royal Commission on Chinese immigration. We didn't restrict Chinese immigration as early as the US did, which created an interesting cross-border traffic, I guess, or movement of Chinese people. And part of that was because of British imperial obligations and things like that. There's much more to it than that, but time is of the essence. Hope that helps.
As an overview, that was really interesting. And I guess my question to Peter is not the same, but it's about this universal versus cultural specificity that you talk about. And I'm a historian of childhood and youth. So I'm interested in how the drug scene inform ideas about youth, and youth inform ideas about the drug scene in the late 1980s or in the 80s, as you're talking about, because people don't talk about Manchester youth. They talk about British youth. So who's perpetuating these images of youth, and how does that inform the ideas about drugs as well?
Yeah, I guess that's quite a big question. I suppose one of the things that I kind of think about with my kind of allusion to Stanley Cohen and the start of the talk is that these so-called moral panics kind of circulate with every kind of generation of new youth, and so you can kind of see continuity in that sense. I mean, I guess I'm arguing for kind of specificity in kind of contrast to this discourse around kind of the kind of universalizing affect of ecstasy, that everybody's ecstasy experience is the same, or that it's the same in Manchester in 1989 as it is in I don't know, Coachella or something in 2018 or 2019 or something. I don't think that's the case at all. And I guess the kind of question about youth, again, I think it's the older generation not understanding what the younger generation are up to. It's that quite sort of familiar story in a way, and that the drugs in this instance, as well as the kind of attendant music, being the kind of folk devils, again, to use Stanley Cohen's phraseology.
Thank you. We've got questions coming in now. So maybe for Dan, our main concern today in Scotland and America, USA, is around opiate-related deaths, probably up again in Scotland last year with figures I delayed. Was overdose death a particular concern in the 19th and early 20th century in producing legal controls? So Ian Smith's asking this. And then for Peter, do we have any insight into how government came to give such stark warnings around MDMA before they had enough data? Were they aware that they might be overhyping it and using it as a precautionary principle?
Okay, so the short answer is yes, it was, but not as much as we hear today. The build up to the pharmacy laws included, there was kind of I can't say a panic, but there were a lot of stories about people being poisoned by opium or strychnine or arsenic. Arsenic is a really useful useful in agriculture, for example, but the opium deaths could be overdose deaths, intentional or unintentional. So there are stories of people poisoning other people with opium. When it got to, but after that period, I've seen less of that versus concerns just over addiction, concerns over the habit itself. That was what became a problem. So, and that's how I talked about this shift from the idea of a dangerous drug being one that could kill you to a dangerous drug being one that could addict you, or at least and then eventually not just addiction, but altering your mindset, right? Like which in itself was considered dangerous because it was connected to pleasure, and there's all sorts of other language and discourse in there about that. So yes and no, because we're historians, we have to answer that way. But that's sort of the context of that.
Peter.
Hi, thanks Ian for the question. Yeah, the sort of overhyping question. I mean, I guess I should say that this, although these posters were kind of seemed to be specifically about ecstasy, and there was also a TV advert as well, which was very obviously about ecstasy because it used like a hip house track as the soundtrack, etc., etc. It was actually a much broader kind of anti-drugs campaign. And I think, as I tried to put it in the context of the earlier campaigns on heroin screws you up, and the kind of scaremongering of that, but also that there's this big concern with crack at this time as well. So, you know, I suppose from the government's perspective, from the Department of Health's perspective, you know, there's at least two what seem to be quite novel drugs to contend with. And so I think their response really is to kind of double down on that. Yeah, drugs are bad kind of rhetoric.
Thank you. Eva's asked a couple of questions. So one for Dan, thanks for the paper, Dr. Malik. Did drug use by the racial other inform the production of medical knowledge to the same extent as it did the use of intoxicant consumption in popular culture and reform movement?
Oh, that's a really good question. Oh man, I don't think I can answer that question. I don't, you know, I haven't, it did infiltrate it, but often, so for example, I showed the image of the so-called, the quote, Negro drug fiend, and that was from a medical journal, and there were other medical journals that had that sort of discussion, but a lot of times you'd see in medical journals almost like cautionary tales, right? So a lot of discussion of drugs was, you know, be careful when you're prescribing it, that sort of language. And maybe it was awareness raising, and then there was a lot of overlap. I've seen cases of in asylums of people who were addicts or who were habitués, who, you know, white middle class people from Southern Ontario who had gone to Atlanta and had been partying there, and there were those sorts of connections. But a lot of times in the medical journals, they seem to carve out things like opium smoking from other types of opium use, and treated it as this behavior of the others. I haven't read it with that thought in mind, so that's why I say it's a really good question, because it's making me think it's a bit of a blind spot in some of the works. So thank you for that, but I can't give you more of an answer than that at this point, Eva. Sorry.
Brilliant, thank you. A question for Pedro now, again from Eva. Thanks again for the interesting paper. I wanted to ask if you see parallels to the juxtaposition of drugs, the effects can last forever, and poverty can last forever, and other issues of the Thatcher era. Drugs and wealth, example.
Yeah, good question. I wouldn't say I've seen much of it. I think certainly for the harm reduction charities, they're very keen to kind of, sort of look at the sort of causes of the causes, if you like. You know, why people are choosing to take drugs. Was there also a question about war in there as well? And did I catch that?
There are other parallel issues.
Right, yeah. Because I guess there's also this, so I guess in a lot of the kind of academic, kind of sociological work around rave that's sort of happening at the time in the mid 90s, they're sort of drawing parallels with the 1960s, and saying that, you know, if you, I don't know, if you exchange like Jefferson Airplane for Marshall Jefferson and LSD for MDMA, then, you know, this is the kind of the 60s all over again. And obviously there you have the kind of protests against the Vietnam War, and obviously in the 90s you have protests against the first Gulf War. So I think those kind of parallels are being drawn by academics maybe, but I would say perhaps less so by policymakers. I don't know.
Thank you. That's interesting again. If we come back to Dan, another question for you. So that Leslie Steinitz is very interested in the argument over the distortion of the media in the discourse. For example, coca and cocaine in the late 19th century. Can you talk a little bit more about how we might uncover the other discourses which position such substances in a different way?
So my understanding is that my understanding of the question is that we only have certain types of documentary sources about these, right? So how do we peel away that bias? I think it's a really good question, because so much of what we have is lost in in the silence or the illiteracy of some of the people who would have been experiencing this. I think without any kind of documentary material, there's a few ways. One can be oral tradition, which I think in some cultures, certainly our North American indigenous culture, is respected more than I think some people want it to be respected, but I respect it as well. But then also there can be a certain triangulation of sources. And I'm trying to think of, so making questions of sources around bias, recognizing the bias of the readers, right? That's another great question. So oral traditions, reading, I guess maybe some more discourse analysis around that, but also things like reading one of the things we have, for example, in Canada, with the Royal Commission on Chinese immigration in the 1880s, they did actually go and speak to users, right? And they spoke. They were in Seattle. They were in down in San Francisco, as well as on the West Coast, the U.S. West Coast, and elsewhere. And sometimes these documents do bring up some pretty frank statements, and if you're lucky with a Royal Commission, you get the verbatim testimony, and then read that, also recognizing that it was transcribed, right, by different people. So by an observer. So those, I found commission reports really useful. We also had a Royal Commission in 1909 on Chinese immigration and opium smoking. There's a corruption case through customs out in BC. So those, again, if you read those, recognizing the eyes that are transcribing them, you can actually find a lot of really useful stuff. However, when it comes to, say, the African American experience in the US South, I'm not familiar enough with the sources to know whether folks involved in that were interviewed, and I'm sure there were sociologists doing some of this stuff and anthropologists as well, but that's all I can really say. Sorry.
And we're always limited by our sources. How we can read them. Laura Kelly has asked a question. So she's saying, fantastic talks to both of you, so rich and interesting. Maybe this is a big question, but I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about how we can learn from the history of drug regulation in the past and how it might inform contemporary concerns. And we've got another one on the pandemic coming up as well, but how does it inform how we understand contemporary concerns?
For me?
For both of you, it'd be good to hear your views. And
so
why don't you start?
Maybe Peter can go first, because is that okay?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, I guess. I mean, actually, yeah, I mean, I really struggle with this one, because I think on the one hand, I think our understanding of how kind of novel drugs arrive can inform, I don't know, novel drugs these days, like, GHB or 2CB or something like this. But then on the other hand, I guess as a historian, I'm arguing that the arrival of ecstasy in the mid-1980s is a, temporally contingent event, and that drugs then are totally different to drugs now. So in fact, what I would probably argue is that the way in which history can inform these debates is to treat them as their own unique events, right? That they have to be kind of taken on their own terms, and you can't just kind of take a boilerplate, a template from something that happened 30, 40 years ago.
That's great. By the way, Peter, I really enjoyed your talk. I was like, now I understand subculture. I've seen those things. I think that there's some things we can learn from the deeper history of drug prohibitions and restrictions. I alluded to a bit at the end. I cut a lot of it out for length. Is around the way that certain language is used to damn behavior. And I think we saw some of this in Peter's work as well. We've seen a transition. There's a brilliant essay collection that I use every year teaching health science students, shocks the crap out of them. It's called, geez, what's it called? I can't remember the name of it, but the subtitle is how, health became the new morality, right? It's Jonathan Metzl and Kirkland, I think. And it looks at how language that seems very benign, like health, and I work in a public health department, a program, can actually be used to condemn, right? So we see this a lot. In Canada, we just had a process of legalization of cannabis, and a lot of the policy briefs written about this were actually using health in a very distorting way, right? And then when we talk about harm reduction, health is used in another way. So I think the history where there was a lot of sort of language around morals and the future of the nation that can be transcribed on some of the broader discussions about drug legalization, because there are still that language of the health of the nation, the bodies of the nation, and the children. Like when you talk about the health of children, you're talking about the health of the nation, the future of the country, or the future of the society, culture, whatever you want to use. So I think those things we see can be transcribed, but I agree that each drug has its own culture and needs to be taken uniquely, because the way the language is used in these discussions can have subtle differences. So that's my short answer to that, and that's a short answer.
Thank you, and it would be good to hear a bit more about legalization and how your work has impacted that. But we'll see. We'll go through the other questions first. Peter, while we wait for drug and alcohol policy reform, do you think clubs should be allowed or encouraged to offer harm reduction intervention when they reopen after this pandemic, now that Lifeline is no more and their approach may seem out of date, but is clearly effective, especially for reaching young people as a target audience? And maybe if I could bunch it with another question about the discourse from users about being advised about drug use from non-users and how they react to it, and the extent to which drug use is assessed in terms of gender. 3 big questions, off you go.
Yeah, so I should probably preface my answer by saying that I don't, although I've given quite a positive account of Lifeline in this particular talk, like I don't want to set them up, especially as like the good guys. Like I don't think it kind of works like that. As historians, I'm not sure that we should be thinking of kind of historical actors in that form. Having said that, I think, I don't know, again, me speaking personally rather than all my kind of historical opinion is that, I think pill testing, for example, in clubs and festivals is a very sensible idea. Organizations such as the Loop. My comment about pills today not being the same as pills in 1989. I think there's a whole load of stuff that demonstrates that pills today are like 2 or 3 times as strong as they were then. And obviously there's kind of, sorry to use this word, health risks kind of associated with that kind of strength of pill. So yeah, probably a sensible thing. The other two questions, I guess the one about gender is really interesting, and Lifeline think about that in some really interesting ways. And actually, I'm writing a paper about that at the moment. So they produce some material specifically aimed at women, and invent these two new characters who they describe as like female Peanut Pete's, so Claire and Josie, and they sort of track their kind of adventures in Clubland. And then I think the other question was about users and non-users and the kind of conversation between them. Yeah, I mean, Lifeline is a really interesting example because I think when it starts, it does tend to be like ex-users talking to current users, and they're kind of concentrated on amphetamines and heroin. And then when ecstasy comes in, they're all a bit older than the kids going to the clubs. So they're like, what is this new drug? We don't understand it. And so, yeah, I mean, they do come up with some, like, I would say, pretty patronizing and condescending material. So, for example, one of the recommendations that they make, I think in the Safer Dancing guidelines, is that if the DJ is playing particularly fast music, then he should play like a slow he or she should play like a slow record, like every hour or so. It's like, that's not really how clubs work.
Thank you again, Peter. Maybe one more for Dan, and it refers to the two papers together, actually. So Peter describes this escapism from deindustrialization in Thatcher's Britain. As a sinologist, says Christopher, I'm used to an idea of early 19th century Chinese addicts as escaping from poverty and general misery in the dying days of Imperial China. Coleridge, on the other hand, is drinking laudanum in the 1810s as an addict, but initially addicted for pain relief. Could you comment on how the racist attitudes towards the Chinese opium smokers might have interacted with the moralizing towards European addicts, such as Coleridge or De Quincey?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Christopher. I mean, it's hard to say how much interaction there was in people's understandings of the two types of opium in the West. I mean, De Quincey does have some of the sort of exotic characters in some of his hallucinations, so there's definitely a recognition of that. But I think you kind of, in a way, answered the question yourself, because there was this very different view of Chinese opium smokers. As it was not contextualized the way you've just contextualized it, right? So we end up with a view of these degraded people, being Chinese people, from missionaries and from other visitors to China. And there, by the way, there were a lot of visitors to China who rejected that, but they didn't have the kind of platform or voice. There's a lot of great literature on it, well, there's a bit. And so I think it was kind of, they looked at the romantics as, well, you know, they're romantics, they're elites, they're doing their own thing, right? And that there's a bit of a personal, you know, a personal pleasure seeking there that doesn't have the same kind of impact as, say, you know, a Chinese opium smoker representing this character of all Chinese people, right? Because it was not a contextualized sort of understanding, or they chose not to contextualize it for their audience. I don't know if that's a great answer to your question. It's a really great question, but I think that at least in the historical literature, for the most part, I haven't seen a lot of those connections. I mean, I've seen it written in medical journals where they talk about opium, so-called opium eating and then opium smoking. But again, as I mentioned earlier, they tended to treat them very differently because of the people who were engaging in it. And that may have changed, well, it definitely changed at the end of the century when they were concerned about Westerners smoking opium. But at the time you're talking about, it did seem to be separate, possibly because so many people were familiar with the medical use of opium, but also because the laudanum drinking subculture, right, was its own sort of group of bon vivants and Epicureans. That's all
Thank
I
you.
got.
Really interesting. Now, I'm just noticing the time and we really should wrap up now. Thank you to the audience for coming and listening and participating and asking questions, and we didn't get through them all, but thank you for that. Thank you particularly to Dan and to Peter for sharing their knowledge with us and for answering the questions so well. And I'm sure they'd both be happy to be contacted if you have further questions and you want to engage because of your own research. Before we end as well, can I remind you again about the session on the 13th of August, and that will focus on the histories of birth control, so really quite different. But please sign up via Eventbrite again and come along and participate in that too. And thank you all.
Thank you for sharing.